Hello everybody, and in this video I'm going to be introducing you to 3D procedural textures. Here's the mesh I'll be working with. The first thing I'm going to do is open up what is called the Hypershade. It's the little blue sphere. Opening up the Hypershade, I'm going to create a new material, in this case a blin. And by middle mouse dragging it onto my mesh, the material will be applied. With my material selected, I can go into my attribute editor, and in the color channel I will click on the checkerboard, and I'm going to apply a 3D procedural texture, in this case granite. It is always advisable to periodically render your scene to actually see what the material looks like on your mesh. You cannot trust your working viewport. Here I'm going to click on the render button, and there it is. Now there's an additional option called the IPR Render, which allows you to modify your materials interactively, making working with materials much easier. In my IPR render, I'm marquee selecting the area I want to interactively work with, and I'm going to select what is called the Place 3D Texture node. This is one of the things I really like about 3D procedural textures. It's very interactive, it's very responsive. I can adjust the way that my material is applied to my mesh by interactively adjusting the size and placement of this node. Notice how the IPR render in the area that I marquee selected updates fairly quickly. Returning to my Hypershade, I'm going to select the material and look at its network. By selecting the material and clicking on the Input-Output button, you can focus in on your shader network. Notice that I have my material, I have a texture feeding into the color channel of my material, and I have my placement node. The best way to start learning about 3D procedural textures is to create many of them and play around with the various parameters. Here I'm trying different colors for my granite material, or texture rather. Notice that the IPR render is only updating the area that I marquee selected. This not only speeds up the process of working with materials, it also is a handy way to compare and see how you've changed your texture. Through play and experimentation, you will learn a lot about these procedural shaders. I recommend creating them and then changing the various parameters and just seeing what they do. Notice that, like the color channel in my material, these different parameters for my granite texture also have checkerboards to the right, indicating that I can make further connections. Here I've applied another 3D procedural texture to the blue area of my granite texture. This marble texture has its own placement node, which I can adjust independently of the other one. Your shader network can get quite complex. I use the Hypershade. The Hypershade will make it easier to make sense of your shader network as well as select the individual nodes in the network itself. I'm going to select my material and go to the bump mapping channel. Clicking on the checkerboard, I will select another 3D procedural texture. I will apply noise as a bump map. Once again, it'll create another 3D placement node, which I can adjust. I can also adjust the values of the bump node itself. And there it is applied as a bump map. Don't forget to periodically look at the results as a render. Your materials can become quite complex. The Hypershade will really help you make sense of your shader network. Similarly to my 2D procedural texture demo, I'm going to create 4 duplicates of this teddy bear. I'm also going to create 4 new blend materials, and I will assign each blend a different color. I will then apply my materials to each of the meshes. Selecting my first material, I'm going to go to the color channel and I'm going to apply a stucco 3D procedural texture. Remember to press 6 on your keyboard to see the results. I'm going to change the colors of my material so that they are black and white. Now I'm going to move on to my second material. Going to the Hypershade, I will select the green material. With the material selected, I am going to go to the Texture tab. This is the very same texture applied to my first material. I'm going to middle mouse drag this texture to the transparency channel of my green material, and we will see it applied as transparency. Moving on to my third material, I will go to my Hypershade, select the material, once again going to the Texture tab, taking that very same texture, but this time I will apply it to the bump channel of my material. And there it is, applied as a bump. The very same texture. Remember that you can fine-tune your bump texture by changing the values of the bump depth. And finally, moving on to my fourth material, I'll select it. Once again, I will go to the textures, and I will middle mouse drag it into the eccentricity property of the material. This will affect its specularity. And once again, I can fine-tune it by adjusting some of the other parameters of my material. And there you have it. One 3D procedural texture being applied to 4 different properties on 4 different materials: color, transparency, bump, and specularity. With all 4 of my materials selected, I can look at it in the Hypershade, and what you will see is that the one texture is feeding into 4 different materials and 4 different properties on those materials. And you also notice that they all share the same Place 3D texture node. Let's take a look at some of the interesting properties of 3D procedural textures. I can select my placement node either by directly selecting it in my viewport, selecting it in the outliner, or in the Hypershade. If I scale up my placement node, you'll see that it has an effect of scaling my material, my texture, rather. If I move the placement node, it appears that the material is swimming through my meshes. And if I move the mesh appears to be swimming through the texture. If I select both the placement node and the mesh, notice that the mesh does not swim through the material. For the second half of this demo, I'm going to delete 3 of the teddy bears, and work with just one material. I am going to also delete my unused materials so they're not cluttering up my Hypershade workspace. If I wish to break a connection, I can simply right-click on the channel. In this case, I'm going to click on the color channel, and I can break the connection. That'll break the connection from my texture to the color channel of my material. I can also break or reconnect in the Hypershade itself by simply mouse dragging a connection or detachment. I'm going to break the connection to the color channel, and I'm going to use this map as a bump map instead. While you can do much of this work in the Hypershade itself, you may actually find it easier to just middle mouse drag the nodes into the attribute editor of the material itself. Now that I have my bump map, I'm going to take the very same texture and apply it to the eccentricity channel of my material. I'll select my material, middle mouse drag it onto eccentricity. So now the same texture is being used for both a bump and for the specular property of my mesh, although I can still fine-tune the other parameters to get the effect that I desire. I actually don't want my mesh to be black and white, although the black and white textures work best for things like transparency and some of the other properties. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my texture and I'm going to duplicate its shader network. That way I'm not recreating a texture, I'm simply duplicating it. And I'm going to feed that node into the color channel. This is going to allow me to use the same texture more or less, but actually change the colors. I'll make a couple adjustments to the color as well as the specular properties of my material. And it starts to look a little bit like a statuette made out of metal with perhaps some corroded and rusted areas. For what will be the rusted area, I'm going to select the 3D Procedural texture, and I'm going to apply yet another procedural texture to it. That way I can get a little more variation in color in there. And I will change those two colors to something that looks a little bit more like rust, something that's like reddish orange. And I will adjust that new 3D Procedural Textures placement node to make further adjustments. Not only are 3D procedural textures and shaders fun to create, they also have some distinct advantages to textures using images. Here's what my model looks like rendered. And here's my second mesh with one distinct difference. If we look at the first one and open up the UV editor, you will see that it in fact has a good UV layout. The second one, the UVs are a mess. But notice that when I apply my new material to the mesh, it'll in fact look pretty good. In fact, you can't tell that it doesn't have a good UV layout, that it hasn't been UV unwrapped or mapped appropriately. I'm now going to demonstrate one other interesting property of these 3D procedural textures and shaders. And once again, we'll focus on our original mesh. So here, I'm creating a cube, scaling it up, non-uniform scale, and doing a quick rotation on it. I'm going to go to my Hypershade, and I'm going to apply the very same material onto that piece of geometry. Now, selecting both, the teddy bear selected first, the cube selected second, I'm going to do a Boolean operation. Notice that when I move the cube, that the material actually looks like it has an interior. It actually looks like a solid three-dimensional form. This is one of the very powerful qualities or properties of a 3D procedural texture and shaders using them. While 3D procedural textures do not require UV unwrapping or mapping, I'm going to now demonstrate why I think it's still worth the effort to properly UV unwrap your mesh. With both my mesh and material selected, in my Hypershade I'm going to go to Edit, Convert to File Texture. Here you can set the file type as well as the size of your texture. I'm going to make mine 2048 by 2048. It takes a moment to convert, but now you will see that it's made a second material in my Hypershade, which it's applied to the mesh. This is not using my 3D procedural texture any longer. It is actually using images as textures. These images I could bring into the Unity game engine, for example, or I could bring it into any other 3D package. With my render, you can see it looks pretty good, although maybe the bump value is a little too exaggerated, so I'm going to make some fine-tune adjustments to my bump. I'll just bring the value down a little bit, and that looks better. Anytime you're working with images as textures, it's always a good idea to work in a project. I'm going to go to my project, which is called Materials, and I'll go to the source images where textures tend to live. Here is where it created my textures when I did the conversion. Let's take a quick look at them. One of these is being used as the bump map, the other is being used as the specularity, and then this one is the color map. So there you have it. There's my demo of using 3D procedural textures. Thanks for watching.